ครับสวัสดีครับ Good afternoon everybody to all distinguished guests and venerable monks who are attending our work, our who are attending our lecture today. So today our South Asian Languages Section Department of Eastern Languages, Chulalongkorn University would like to welcome all of you to our special lecture with the topic that are very interesting, entitled the Gandhari Buddhist Manuscript Collection at the Islamabad Museum, Pakistan, preserving Pakistan's antique Buddhist literary heritage. So today we have very honored to have Professor Mark Allon from University of Sydney, Australia, to be our speakers today. For the short biography of Associate Professor Mark Allon, it is Sanskrit, Pali, and Gandhari, and also Buddhist Indians and Asian Studies at the University of Sydney, Australia. His primary research interests are the composition and transmissions of early Buddhist literature, the ways in which text has been used by the Buddhist communities, and the Indic languages of the early Buddhist text. He is involved in two major research projects. The first concerned the study and publications of the recently discovered Gandhari Buddhist manuscript from the Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the second involved the conservation, photographing, and the studies of the Cathedral Pagoda marble stele recensions of the Pali Canon in Mandalay, Myanmar. And he is the author of The Style and Function, a study of dominant stylistic features of the portions of the Pali canonical Sutta text and monetic functions in 1997, and the three Gandhari Ekotrikakamathai Sutra in the British Library Caloshti fragment 12 and 14 in 2001, and the composition and transmissions of the early Buddhist texts with a specific reference to Sutra in 2021. And for today, he will give an account of the Gandhara Buddhism and the new manuscript discovery and their importance. And we'll discuss how the Gandhari manuscript collection at the Islamabad Museum and the conservations, housing, photographing, studying, and publications of these manuscripts, which is being carried out by the Gandhari Manuscript Projects, or GMP, under the agreement signed between the Federal Department of Archaeology and Museum, Islamabad, Pakistan, and the University of Sydney, Australia. So please welcome Professor Mark Allon.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, fine. Do I need to share screens, or that's already happening? Everything's okay? Okay, fine. So welcome. Thank you for coming. So some of you may have heard the background material, just a few of you. We had a workshop in Hua Hin just recently, but I'll also introduce new material. I'll probably speak for just over an hour, and then we can open up for discussion and questions. As the title suggests, I want to talk about a particular collection of manuscripts that are now housed at the share my screen. Is that okay? Get rid of this. Loading controls. Are we all good to go? Yep. Okay, so I want to talk about one particular collection, but to talk about that collection, I'll talk about all of the an overview of all of the new manuscript discoveries that have come out of Afghanistan and Pakistan in the last 30 years, basically. And to understand that manuscripts don't exist in a void, I want to introduce you, because some of you may not be familiar with the cultural realm zone in which these manuscripts come from, so you understand the culture that produced them or have a better idea. So some of you may already know this, but it's just a background. So the area we're talking about is the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, which is a very important area because it was through this region that Buddhism spread into Central Asia and then China and beyond, and even onto Iran. There were Buddhist communities in Iran. And it's also the region through which Indian civilization more broadly spread beyond its boundaries in that direction. Of course, there were sea routes as well. Gandhara proper sits around Peshawar in the Swat Valley, but the broader greater Gandhara region is sort of runs from Bamiyan in Afghanistan to Gilgit in the north down to Taxila. And that's called Greater Gandhara because of cultural similarities, use of Gandhari language in the early phase at least, also artistic features, forms of Buddhism and so on, right? It's a rough category, just a working category. And also this area, not only did, Buddhism and Indian civilization ideas move up into Central Asia and beyond, everybody who invaded India up until the time of the British came in through this region. So it was a particularly rich area in terms of cultures, languages, religions, right? And it also was very important for not only transmission of Buddhism to China at this early period, but also developments in Buddhism itself, artistic traditions, Abhidharma, etc., etc. So this region first comes into sort of at least the greater history, world history, through the Persian Empire, which occupied it 600 BC, 400 BC, and then Alexander of Macedon, or Alexander the Great, the Greeks. Macedonians actually took that region from them. So we have Iranian influence in the northwest and then Greek influence, 4th century. So consequence, you actually get a Greek city like Iconium in northern Bactria, that's northern Afghanistan, which has Greek inscription, Greek gods, Greek city layout, etc. Or in Pakistan now, Swat Valley, Barikot has layers beginning with the Persians, and even before that, this fortification, it also has Greek layers. So it's the most eastern Greek layers. Then as a consequence, it's a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic environment. The Greeks are issuing coins with their gods on them. The Kushans, a bit later, are issuing, coins with the Buddha, although not a lot of them. Iranian gods, what we might refer to as Indian gods, and so on, right? Panini himself, the great grammarian, was born in this area. So this and images like this of Lakshmi from Gandhara, or Lakshmi with an inscription underneath saying that this is an image of Lakshmi, point to, or this one here, an inscription in the Gandhari language referring to a Brahmin who commissioned the building of a Shiva temple, right? Indicate strong presence of Brahmanical religion apart from Iranian and Greek and many other strands. But despite that, Buddhism is by far the strongest religion in that region, right? Now, it was introduced supposedly 3rd century BC under the Emperor Ashoka, who, as we know, apparently sent his missionaries off, his Mahamatras, to different parts of his realm, though it's probably likely that you had monastics who were moving up into that area before this, that we just don't have a record of that. Now, even though Buddhism is supposedly officially introduced in this period, Buddhism, we know, spreads with the help of empires. So even though Buddhism's introduced that period, it's thought that Buddhism doesn't really become a major force in the area until perhaps the 1st century BC onwards. But you get, say, this is the Dharmarajika stupa in Taxila, which is in Pakistan. It's a beautiful example, this aerial view of a classic Buddhist monastery with the stupa, the production of passageway around it, the niches where icons would have been, subsidiary small stupas around that of saints being buried, and then the monastery nearby or next to it with the library, quick kitchen, and so on, right? It's a very nice site. Buddhism really is, coming into its own and its strongest in the sort of the first century of the Christian era, particularly under the Kushans. The Kushan emperors were not necessarily overtly Buddhist, but they supported Buddhism. And the Kushan Empire links the Gangetic lowlands, the heartland of where the Buddha lived and so on, with Gandhara up into Central Asia, Bactria, and so on. So that facilitates the spread of Buddhism into Central Asia and the Silk Route and China. Yep. That stability that the empire provides. So you get in this region, particularly Pakistan and the central areas of Gandhara, really, amazing examples of Buddhist architecture like this, this Taktibai monastery, stupas, the great site of Bamiyan, which had these great Buddhas, unfortunately now destroyed, which had a rich painting tradition, mostly lost, was on a trade route. I'll talk about them later. Many manuscripts found here. Now, Gandhara, as I said, played a central role in key developments in Buddhism. One of them is the shift from the aniconic representation of the Buddha, that is representing the Buddha in symbols, feet, chair, Bodhi tree, etc., to the iconic representation. And you see the image on the right is the story of King Udayan of Kausambi. The Buddha goes up to Tushita to preach to his, to preach the Abhidharma to his mother and the gods. And Udayana misses the Buddha so much that he commissions one of his courtiers to create an image of the Buddha. The Buddha comes back down, and the king presents it to the Buddha, and the Buddha approves it. Now, this is a foundation story of why it's legitimate to have an iconic image of the Buddha, right? But this was, it was here in Mathura simultaneously, probably, and it was, profound impact on the visual art traditions, the Buddhist art traditions. That is, suddenly artists are freed to represent all, episodes in the Buddha's life and many other things as well. So Gandhara has a particularly rich repertoire of images of the life of the Buddha. Yeah. It was also important, the artistic tradition absorbed influences from India, of course, India proper, and then Greek, the Mediterranean world, the Greek, Central Asian as well. You look here, there's an image on the right of Gandhara, an image, standing Buddha and a standing Buddha from Mathura. One on the left, Mathura, very stiff in some ways. Can you hear that repetition, that echo? No? Can you hear an echo? It's just me then. Okay. There's an echo developing. So you get an image like this. So you get an image like this, which is Hariti. Remember the story of Hariti? She's a demoness who grabs a child in Rajgir, one every day, to feed her sons, 500 sons. And here she is in complete Greek garb as Taik Fortuna, right? And Panchika, her partner, right? They're dressed up as Greeks. Yeah. Gandhara had a very rich tradition of establishing relics. That echo's got worse. Yeah. Of establishing relics and you get many inscriptions in which it describes how that these relics were established in a place where Buddhism didn't exist before, right? Like in this inscription. Okay. Hello? Hello? No, it doesn't make any difference. So still doing it. Whoa, even worse. There's nothing sound, so it won't, that won't cause it. Hello? Hello? Yeah. Hello? 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 That's right. Hello? Is that better? Yeah, that's better. Okay. Okay. Let me just find where we're up to. Now, also, as many Buddhist lands, the land became part of the Buddhist realm by stories that were originally set in the Buddha's homeland, the area where he was active, taken by the Gandharans, that the Buddha was active in that region. So this story, the taming of the Naga serpent Apalala, that is, originally that story is set in Magadha, but it was the Gandharans had an account that the Buddha flew up to Gandhara and he converted Apalala in the Swat area. And you have, say, the story is told, and that the Chinese tell the story, and that after taming Apalala, the Buddha left his footprints in the mud by the river, and here you have a stone with his footprints with an inscription which says, "These are the footprints of the Sakyan sage," right? And the Chinese saw this, the pilgrims, and paid respect to it, as they did. Same with Jataka stories were set up in the Gandharan region. And this is a very common phenomenon. That is, the Buddhist Holy Land expands to incorporate your realm. Chinese pilgrims come through this region from the 5th century, at least in the records, with Fa Xian onwards, and they leave an account of the state of Buddhism in this area. And, these, and I think as an attestation to the status of Gandhara, they are not coming to Gandhara just merely because it's on the way to India proper and the main sites. They come here to pay respect to the places where the Buddha has been and to the Holy Land. And also there are centers of learning in Gandhara, right? And to look for manuscripts. Now, the language of this area we know of in the early period, that is from about when we first get record of it in Ashokan inscriptions, the 3rd century BC, up until at least the 3rd or 4th century, is called Gandhari. This is a name that was coined by Harold Bailey, a modern scholar, because the region we know in historical records is called Gandhara. You get it in Iranian inscriptions, Persian inscriptions, so he called it Gandhari. It's a Middle Indo-Aryan language. It's sort of somewhat akin to Pali in its relationship to Sanskrit. But the language was also, you also can get inscriptions and usages in northern Afghanistan, Bactria, and then up in the northern Silk Route and the southern Silk Route, right? Any of you have been exposed to Gandhari, some of the students, my former students here and so on, I would consider linguistically more advanced than Pali. Pali preserves consonants mostly. It doesn't like dissimilar consonants, but so this word Rajatarupa, Jatarupa, Rajata, can turn up in Gandhari many different spellings because the spelling was never standardized in Gandhari. One of which I have here, which is Jajarua Raida, right? So consonants are dropping out, short A's palatalized, weakening of consonants and so on. Multiple spellings because the spelling's not standardized. The word dharma could be spelt in a Sanskritic way, dharma or dhamma, 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 that's metathesis, dhamma, dharma, and so on. Look at the word cha. I'm not going to read them all out. These are the reflexes of this word, multiple, right? All of the little joyful things that make dealing with Gandhari manuscripts fantastic. The cases start collapsing further. You know that in Pali, the dative and the genitive collapse. This starts happening even further in Gandhari. Loss of syllables, Also in the script is called Kharoshthi, and it didn't really develop. It did have it, but in a later stage was never really used. It doesn't mark long vowels and it doesn't mark double consonants, geminates, right? So again, this is yet another thing that makes dealing with this material interesting. Two main scripts of India, Kharoshthi, which goes from right to left, not left to right, and that's based on the Aramaic of the Persian Empire. And then Brahmi, which is supposedly a product of the Ashokan court. For administrative, the first instance we have is Ashokan inscriptions. And that, of course, goes from left to right. And that's the origin of all Indic and all Southeast Asian scripts except Arabic. These are the first attestations of the Gandhari language that we have, namely the inscriptions of Ashoka. So when Ashoka, of course, is using a Prakrit of his capital in Magadha, and when he sends them out, the scribes change the linguistic features to what they think suits the region. And here, not only is that being changed to the Gandhari language, which of course is very similar, has different features, but also it's written in Kharoshthi, and that shows that Kharoshthi predates Brahmi, I think. Otherwise, it would have been written in Brahmi script. But then when Ashoka, unlike anywhere else in India, when Ashoka sends his edicts up to the northwest, some of them are translated into Greek and Aramaic. So he's communicating with the remnants of the Persian Empire and the Greeks. Yep. And we knew about this language through inscriptions, so on reliquaries like this, on coins. The Greeks issued bilingual coins, Greek on one side, Gandhari on the other side. Reliquary inscriptions like these, which were put into little reliquaries and interred with the ashes, supposedly of the Buddha and other precious things, into stupas. They talk about the foundation of the relics in that stupa, or on images like this one here, a beautiful image which is on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has an inscription: in the year 4 of the 5th day of the month of Palguna, the pious gift of Buddhananda, learned in the 3 Pitakas, may it be for the honoring of the deceased father and mother, right? So this monk has commissioned the creation of this beautiful image. You also get on the trade routes that are going up from the northwest, so what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan. On those trade routes, the traders, the Buddhist monks who are passing through, are leaving inscriptions on rocks, images, Buddhist images, inscriptions in different languages, so Sanskrit, Gandhari, Tibetan, Chinese, Sogdian, Hebrew, and so on, right? Now, this language was also used in the southern Silk Route in a kingdom called Shanshan or Koraina, and it doesn't look much now. It's a desert, but it must have been a thriving, rich, agriculturally rich community at one point. And these are basically secular documents. And the people who were using this language were not Indians, but Iranian speakers. So in the late 19th century, this manuscript was found. This is what's referred to as Khotan Dhammapada, and this remained the only Buddhist literary document for 100 years, right? And this hinted, and there was a lot of speculation of, does this show that there were Buddhist canons in the Northwest and so on? And so the argument went on. And of course, that was 100 years goes by until we have to wait till finally in the early 1990s, the manuscripts, these Gandhari manuscripts start turning out. And that's what I'm really talking about today. So the first was the British Library, found in a pot, this photograph in the Peshawar Bazaar. All of these go through the antiquities trade, and most of them left the country. So they are birch bark scrolls, and Richard Solomon dated them to the 1st century of the Common Era. He wrote this introductory book, 29 different scrolls, approximately 23 different texts by 21 scribes. He argued that they were old, worn-out scrolls that were put in a pot and interred somewhere because they couldn't be destroyed, right? Because they were the Buddha Vachana. He published the first text, which is the Rhinoceros, Kaggavisana Sutta of the Sutta Nipata, a Gandhari version of that. And then I published the second one in the series, which is a collection of 3 short sutras of the Anguttara Ekotrikagama type texts. Collett Cock just published this great book on an Abhidharma. So in this collection, apart from actually the first 2 publications might think that they're mostly sort of canonical texts, using that term rather loosely, but in fact, the majority don't have parallels. Reason we published the canonical ones first is because they had parallels in other languages, which helped us a lot. And so they were easy to deal with. Collett Cock, this took 20 years to publish this. It's an Abhidharma, very, very good introduction to the Abhidharma genre, the development of it. And these texts are witnessing early phases in the development of Abhidharma, right? This particular one, so there's a passage there which is an argument against a Sarvastivadin position that all Dhammas exist, right, in the 3 time periods. This collection it's argued that it was produced by a Dharmaguptaka community. Now, the Dharmaguptakas were parallel to, just another one of the early schools, and their literature only survived in 1 or 2 Chinese translations. So here we have a whole collection which apparently is produced by them. So it's suddenly giving us a window into their literature, at least a snippet of their literature. Apart from Abhidharma, there's commentaries, and so on, short stories, etc. Just as a side, we're dealing with birch bark. So this is a birch tree. You can see the way the bark peels off. You peel off the outer layer of the bark, and you then cut the inner layers. You go through some form of treatment. We don't know what that is. And you can produce a long scroll by gluing sections of bark together and sewing it across the glue line and up the margins to stop it splitting, or you can produce a short, fat format scroll. Both formats happen. Then we have images. Here you have some images of writing in Gandhara, particularly the Buddha going to school and learning to write on wooden boards, which probably you washed and then rewrote the next day. But the central one is particularly interesting. It depicts 3 monks debating using scrolls. You can see the way the scroll works. It's not the Chinese format horizontally, it's vertically, right, for the scroll format. The script, Kharoshthi, as I said, it's written from right to left. You use a reed pen. Here's a reed pen. It's split at the nib, if you like, at the head, which holds ink. And sometimes you see on the right-hand side this image, both are the same letter, but the vertical line, as the scribe pressed hard, the nib split, and you don't get a solid block of ink, you get 2 lines with a blank in between, right? So that shows you, this is Andrew Glass's worked in Seattle. These are ink pots from the Taxila Museum. The ink is a carbon-based ink. I had it analysed at the University of Sydney, but we need to know more about it. Okay, so further collections start turning up in the 1990s. This one, the Robert Senior collection, it was a private dealer, had it for many years, had it conserved at the British Library, and then lent it to University of Washington Library in Seattle, and then just recently donated it to the library, which was very generous of him. Joe Marino's heading this project now. I've done quite a lot of work on this as well. Interesting because it again was found in a pot, and this has an inscription on the pot and the lid, which indicates that it was a commission. That is, a layperson called Rohana commissioned a collection of basically sutras which have their parallel in the Samyutta Nikaya or Samyutta, or biographical accounts of the Buddha, something from that, to be interred, not to be read, but to be interred in a stupa, right? So they're written, whereas the British Library were multiple scribes, old scrolls, this one by one scribe, probably in a couple of sittings, put into a pot, interred in a stupa, apparently for merit making, he says. Now, the sutras, as I said, many have their parallels, Samyutta Nikaya, Samyukta or this one here, the Anatta Lakkhana, to use the Pali word, found also in the Vinyas as part of the narrative of the Buddha, and Chinese, etc., etc. This is here as a manuscript which contains the story of the two merchants, Tapussa and Balika, who give the Buddha his first meal, and on the other side of the Nagaraja Elapatra and the Brahmin youth Nala, right? Now, the story of Tapussa and Balika giving the Buddha his first meal is a particularly interesting one, because this collection also, like the British Library, it appears to have been produced by a Dharmagupta community. So although the pot doesn't say that it was, sorry, I forgot to mention the British Library manuscripts were found in a pot that said property of the Dharmaguptakas, so that's some indication, but this one didn't. However, if there is a parallel to the text under study in Chinese in Dharmaguptaka, then that story is closest to that version as opposed to any other. So I argue that it's also would have been produced by the Dharmaguptakas, and they were quite a strong Nikaya in the Northwest. Now, that story about Tapussa Balika is a foundational story for several things. One is, you might know the story, that is, the Buddha gives them his hair and his nail parings, right? Or at least in the Dharmaguptaka version. And they think, why is the Buddha giving us these impure things? Because in Indian tradition, they're impure. And the Buddha reads their minds and says, you shouldn't think like this. Even the gods venerate these things. So that's a foundation story for why Buddhists would practice the veneration of bodily relics, right? Similarly, it's important because it establishes merchants as fundamentals to the patronage of Buddhism and several other things. Yeah. Also the veneration of the bowl. The story, the Buddha doesn't want to, he's not an ascetic anymore. He's a Buddha. He doesn't want to accept a meal in his hands like he did when he was a begging ascetic. And the gods of the four direction read his mind, offer him 4 bowls, and he thinks, well, I can't deny them the merit from doing this, but I don't need 4 bowls, so he crushes them into one. And that bowl was actually seen, was taken apparently by Kanishka as war booty from the Gangetic lowlands up to Gandhara, and was seen by the Chinese pilgrims, right? It also contains the beginning, at least the narrative portions of what in Pali is called the Samanyapala Sutta. We were just reading this in a workshop. Also a very interesting text. So most of the sutras have parallels in the Samyutta Nikaya, Samyukta. This one main primary parallel is Digha Nikaya, Digha. Some have parallels in Majjhima Nikaya, Majjhima, and some in the Vinyas. Yep. But all of them are canonical texts. And then you have yet more manuscripts, really huge cachet turning up from Bamiyan. This is based on the chaos that's happening in those decades in Afghanistan. So supposedly a wall of a cave broke down, and manuscripts that span basically 2nd century of the Christian era to the 8th century. So really a massive period. Early manuscripts are Gandhari language, Khroshti script. Later ones are Sanskrit. So they witness the shift in that Buddhist community, at least, from the use of the Gandhari language, Khroshti script, to Sanskrit and Brahmi. Yep. So quite important witnesses to that shift. The collections here, this is just a quick summary. I don't know, maybe you can't read that. So you have Agama Sutras, that is, different agamas. You have individual sutras. You have Vinaya texts, Abhidharma texts, but then you have a whole swathe of Mahayana texts, and then other texts like the Shokavadana, Huviska legend, Jatakamala of Aryashura, and so on and so on, poetical works and the like. So really, very rich representations. Yet another collection now, this is that collection has Gandhari and Sanskrit. this collection, Bajau, is just Gandhari, and it is very diverse. So this one here, the image you're looking at, is a Mahayana text resembling the Akshobhya Vyuha Sutra, right? It's by currently being edited by Ingo Strauch and Andreas Schlosser. Andreas Schlosser, Germany, Munich, just published this book, which is three early Mahayana treatises from Gandhara, right? So this appears to have been an authored work. That is, the scribe is the author, and he's writing out his ideas that have about the Dharma that have Mahayana flavor. Yet further split collection, 5 manuscripts, which includes the earliest witness to perfection of wisdom, Prajnaparamita, 1st century of the Common Era, dated based on carbon dating, a Dhammapada, not the Dhammapada. There isn't such a thing as the Dhammapada anyway, but it's not the same as the Khotan Gandhari Dhammapada. So just another anthology of verses. A single manuscript Gandhari at the Library of Congress. This is could be referred to as the Bahu Buddha Sutra, the many Buddha Sutras. And yet another manuscript turning up, University of Washington Library, which seems to be Abhidharma scholastic in character. Okay. So yet further manuscripts. This is from the Gilgit region. We think this was Uwe Hartmann and his students. Some of them who are here have worked on these manuscripts, Digagama, Vinaya, etc. Very important Sanskrit manuscripts from a later period, 7th, 8th century. And then even Bactrian manuscripts. Most Bactrian manuscripts are secular documents, but some are Buddhist in character. The language is an Iranian language, but the script is Greek or based on a Greek script. So what are we looking at? We're looking at, since the beginning of the 1990s, really amazing collections of manuscripts from Gandhara dating from approximately the 1st century BC to the 8th century of the Christian era, right? That's spanning a huge expanse of the presence of Buddhism in Gandhara, where before we had monasteries, inscriptions, Chinese pilgrim accounts, but no manuscripts or one. Here we suddenly have whole libraries or sections turning up, right? That's amazing, and it's completely shifting our understanding of at least of Buddhism in that region, at least not Buddhism and its transmission through the region, and then Greater India. You know, the history of the region as well, what schools and forms of Buddhism were present in the region. So now we're getting examples of schools such as the Dharmaguptakas, Mahasangikas, the rise of the Mahayana, etc., that we didn't really have before. So these are the earliest witnesses to those. Development of Buddhist thought and practice, the nature of the texts used by Buddhist communities at different periods, development of Buddhist literature and of Buddhist canons, of course, fundamental for the understanding of the Gandhari language, Kharosthi script, which we based on the very limited corpus of inscriptions and coins we didn't have a very good understanding of. Spread of Buddhism from South Asia into Central Asia and China, understanding of Buddhism in South Asia more generally. They also help us to understand, or will be the basis for understanding Chinese translations, many of which were made not from Sanskrit, as was earlier thought, but from Gandhari versions. And then art historical research. So Gandhara has this amazingly rich artistic heritage, and yet there were no local accounts of stories which art historians could draw on. So that story of Tapusuk and Balik is a very good one, well represented in Buddhist art and Gandhara art. Okay, so this is the collection. That's the background to the collection I want to really talk about, which is the collection at the Islamabad Museum. So as I've said, all of these collections basically left Afghanistan, Pakistan on the antiquities trade and ended up in private and public collections. The exception is the Bajau, but even that is in private collection in Bajau, and we don't know where that came from. So this collection, Richard Solon, myself, and others heard of this in actually, it was seen, photos of it was seen about a decade and a half ago, and then it just disappeared. It went silent. And then the owner contacted people wanting to sell it. And again, it would have left the country. So myself, Richard, and others got together and started working on trying to keep this in Pakistan. And we raised money from particularly the Cancer Foundation, who funded the purchase of it and the donation of it to the Islamabad Museum. So for that, I worked quite a lot with the Australian ambassador in Pakistan and the Pakistan ambassador in Australia, and worked for quite 2 years, or actually more, 4 years, to put together an agreement between my university and the Department of Archaeology and Museum in Pakistan to house that collection at the Islamabad Museum. This is by far the largest collection of Gandhari language manuscripts, so at least 60 birch-bark scrolls or fragments. Now, it turns out you saw the Bajau collection, the Split collection, Library of Congress, and University of Washington scrolls. They were all part of one big collection, and I know that because there are portions of one manuscript in different collections. There are different manuscripts written by the same scribe in the different collections. So it was a mega collection that was on the antiquities sale in Pakistan, and different people bought it, and so we managed to secure the bulk of it and keep it in Pakistan. So, okay, it consists, it was donated to the Islamabad Museum, of basically 38 unconserved scrolls like these ones, right, that come in little paper packets. This one here, really interesting. It's a plastic takeaway container. It's a mess. It'll be a nightmare to conserve, but really interesting. It's bilingual. It's got Gandhari, Kharosthi on one side and Kushan, Brahmi, probably Sanskrit on the other, but it's so fragmentary I can't figure out what the text says so far. So if anybody's got a lot of patience, then they are welcome to work on this one. Okay. Then also, the previous owner had conserved some of these in plastic, hard plastic or soft plastic. The soft plastic was heat sealed, and you see what a mess this one is. It was overheated. So, try to read that. And this July, with the conservators, we tried to open this one. We couldn't. So it looks like the heat sealed ones won't be able to be opened, but the hard plastic ones can be, and we can reconserve this in conservation standard glass. It's called borosilicate glass, right? Okay, so as I said, in 2022, we signed this agreement. The woman standing there is the secretary of the Division of Heritage and Culture in Pakistan. This took a long time, right? The agreement sat on various secretaries' desks for 3 years or something. So it was only when I actually went to Pakistan and started harassing people that we actually got it through. Now, these two manuscripts I saw, or we heard of, at Sam Fogg, which is an antiquity dealer in London, and they had been photographed by Andrew Glass in 2008, right, in this British collector's collection. I saw them at Sam Fogg in 2019. You see they're starting to fall to pieces. So I didn't speak to the owner, but I contacted her through Sam Fogg and said, either you pay quite a bit of money to have them conserved, or they'll just fall to pieces, disintegrate, and or you entrust them to me and I donate them to the Islamabad Museum. So she did the latter. I took them to Sydney, conserved them. I didn't conserve them. I had them professionally conserved, and then they were repatriated to Pakistan. These were part of the original collection as well, right? The owner had started trying to sell them off in different places. And two very interesting texts, Samadhi Raja Sutra and the Pratyutpana, Pratyutpana Buddha Sammukkhavastita Samadhi Sutra, right? So really interesting. This is the Islamabad Museum. Now, it's actually a rented building. The Pakistan government has been promising to build a National Museum for a long time, and they keep on using the money for flood relief or something else. So they rent this building. And in the basement, there were these rooms. Basically, Jason Nealis, who works a colleague of mine, trained by Richard Solomon, works in Canada now. He has a lot of experience in Pakistan, speaks Urdu very well, so we work closely together. We went and set this up. This is he and I inspecting the space that basically the Department of Archaeology Museum, DOAM, said, well, this will be your space to conserve the manuscripts. So you can't conserve manuscripts in that. So we had to raise money, and we raised it from Dhamachai in Thailand, and also the Cancer Foundation for the first phase of the project to basically build a conservation space to conserve them, image them, right? That's the first phase. The second phase is what we're sort of embarking on now. We're still conserving manuscripts, is the publication of the manuscripts. So, okay. Now, the Korean government had actually, in the meantime, built a state-of-the-art conservation space, but not for manuscripts, for non-organic materials like stone, metal, etc. So we still needed to build a paper manuscript conservation space. So this is work in progress. Sometimes I'm there, sometimes I'm doing it from afar. Nothing gets done much unless I'm there. And anyway, finally in 2024, July, I bring across two world-class conservators, one who'd worked on the Dongwan manuscripts of British Library and others. Vania Assis works for a private Portuguese company. The other, Mary French from Boston Public Library, both with birch bark experience. And we worked for 3 weeks conserving manuscripts. So you can see now, even here, this table is a makeshift table. Despite all my efforts, I never got the tables finished, right? So you can see the tables in the background don't have tops on them, right? We don't have cabinets. It's whatever, right? But anyway, it's all fun and games. What's going on? Okay, so these are conserved manuscripts. So here you have, I'm inviting the Australian ambassador along. It's always good to get people like this along and then ask them for money. But unfortunately, the Australians are rather stingy, so they didn't give me any money. But anyway, that's how it is. So then we did a next conservation effort in July 2024. That's a year later. This is really unsatisfactory, but it's very difficult to coordinate the conservators, right? They've got other projects going on and so on. First of all, to get conservators who had the skill to deal with these manuscripts, then to get them together. It's better to get 2 conservators at the same time and to conserve the manuscripts together. Now, Mary French couldn't come. I set up, what I want to do is have Vania, who's the main skilled person, train other highly skilled papyrus conservators. Papyrus is the next best thing after birch bark. And I set up for a French conservator to come. So we were about to go for 2 weeks, and lo and behold, Pakistan and India start lobbing missiles at each other, and then Israel and Iran start doing the same, and they have a border with Iran with Pakistan. So the French woman dropped out; she was too scared. So Vania and I go, right, perfectly fine, it's okay. Anyway, but this was an opportunity also to start training Pakistani conservators, because no one in Pakistan has these skills. So it's part of our mission is to actually do skills transfer. So again, and now this is actually virtually completed lab. You see there's proper table tops. There's cabinets have been installed, but notice in the background, the sink hasn't been done. So I had worked on getting the sink installed for a year as I was in Australia. It just never happened. So anyway, the sink is now installed. You'll be happy to know. Okay. So we have 38 unconserved scrolls, and then 25 scrolls that the previous owner had conserved, or scroll fragments. in either hard plastic or soft plastic. So one of the jobs is to reconserve, as I said, on the left, you have a picture of the soft plastic, hard plastic into borosilicate glass, this one here. So we did that. This is interesting text. Colette Cox is working on it. It is sort of Abhidharma commentary in nature. Now it's often difficult to, those genres are very similar. We have a very beautiful fragment of what in Pali is the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, conserving the remnants of 10 sutras, right? So really interesting. This is earliest levels of Buddhist literature. Similarly, in the early phase, not early, I suppose, classes of literature would be a fragment, quite nice, preserving remnants of the 13 rules of the Sangati Sesha Pratimoksha rule. Now, that's particularly interesting because in manuscript collections from Central Asia and Gandhara, Vinaya texts were not really well represented, and that was thought that that's because Vinaya was transmitted orally, you recited the Pratimoksha and so on. But here we're getting now the first fragments of Vinaya. You see the grey, so this one here, I assembled that. The grey represents where fragments have been overlapped and not the previous owner conserved that. So I need to get the conservators, we'll open the hard plastic and reopen it so that finally that wording can get revealed. This is an interesting, this was one of the first texts published. It was the first text published by Paul Harrison, Timothy Lentz, and Richard Solomon. And it is a fragment of the Pratyutpana Samadhi Sutra. Now, since then, we've found that's chapter 9, I think it is, and 4 other chapters have turned up of this text, right? Or fragments of that. One is almost complete, the rest are very, very fragmentary. So really interesting because, the earliest sort of dated example of the text is a early 5th century Chinese translation. And here you've got a manuscript of about the 1st, 2nd century of the Christian era, right? So by earliest Indic version by centuries. We were reading this in our workshop recently, which is Samadhi Raja Sutra. Small fragment, but nonetheless very interesting. Same story, important Mahayana text. This was the second text in the collection to be published, which I published, it looks fragmentary and not very much, but historically interesting because it's a ledger. That is, it gives an account of the donations by one of the great Kushan kings, Vima Kadphises. He is the father of Kanishka to a Buddhist monastery. And before this, he wasn't recorded as a patron of Buddhism, but he's a good king and he supports Buddhism in his realm. So that's interesting. Okay, so actually what I want to do, just stop here. Okay, I just want to show you a little bit of the conservation of manuscripts. Okay, so how this is done is this is metal tray. So some of the equipment I source in Pakistan, I go along to Rawalpindi market, get things made up or whatever, and some of them I put in my luggage and bring from Italy or Australia or whatever. So basically these are metal trays, stainless steel. You have a layer of blotting paper, and then this material called Bondina and Sympathec. And what that does is you put water in it, the blotting paper holds the moisture, the Sympathec and Bondina stop the manuscript, separate it from the moisture. So you sit it on top and it doesn't stick. You cover it with plastic, you leave it for 2 to 3 days. The manuscript, so this 2,000-year-old birch bark, it's very fragmentary and very dry. It absorbs moisture and becomes pliable, right? So then you're starting to unravel it, right? You take it out of the chamber or mixture of in the chamber and out the chamber. Sometimes you might take it out, unravel it a little bit, then put it back in the chamber, humidify it and so on. So here you can see you've got a glass frame, right? This borosilicate glass. As you what happens naturally is as the scroll is unraveled, it breaks into slits, horizontal slits. You put on it what are basically microscope glass slides, which weigh it down and stop it from curling up, because while you unroll the rest of the scroll, right? And then basically you leave it like that for 3 days once it's conserved to dry out, because you don't want moisture trapped in the frame. It'll start to go moldy. And then you seal it by putting another layer of glass on, and then you tape it, in this case with 2 different types of tape, right? So that is a newly conserved scroll, right? I haven't even put the number on it. In fact, it's a scroll fragment, not the frame number, right? So then this box you see, a cardboard box, it's about 0.5 meter by 30 centimeters, something like that. I had these made up in Rawalpindi Market. Unfortunately, they're not archival standard, right? That means they're acidic. So I eventually need to source archival boxes, but they're temporary. The pink material you see around that is plastizote, which is archival, and that's padding, right? So you basically have one piece of plastizote, and then you cut out a window the size in another piece, the size of the glass frame. The glass frame fits into that. Then you put a full piece of plastizote, and so you can stack them like that, and that preserves them at least temporarily. Okay, so this is a conserved manuscript, right? And then I took with me a large A3 high quality scanner that scans at 2400 dpi, and once it's conserved, I will scan them. So these are producing very beautiful images. You can see here, actually this is not, the quality is not here, but at high, this I'll show you later, actually even better. Okay. So, of course, what I want to do, I mean, all of this building conservation spaces, agreements with governments, etc., it's really because we're actual textual scholars and we want to read the texts, right? So, but I've got to build a conservation space and do all this. Okay, so 2-3 years later, doesn't matter. 2,000-year-old manuscripts, what's time? So, as they're conserving, I'm taking photographs at nighttime. I'm busy away trying to piece them together and identify it. So this is my initial attempt at reconstructing the manuscript. It's written on recto verso. It's not very big, but it's very nice. And look at these little Buddhas, ink images of Buddhas as punctuation marks. So what is this text? It's really interesting. It's a list of Tathagatas, and it's clearly Mahayana in character. It lists 15 different Tathagatas and the benefits of paying honor to them, right? And once that has been finished, you can see here, the little Buddha gives the punctuation mark. I've never seen that before, right? And actually there's another manuscript which just preserves the bottom right knee of a cross-legged Buddha. The image must have been probably, 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters. So here's, examples of ink drawings of Buddhist, right? Very nice. Okay, so I'm going to show a series of videos to conserving. So here's a manuscript. Basically, you're looking, it looks like a cigar, flattened cigar with lots of dandruff around it, which is basically little bits of manuscript. Okay, so it goes into the humidity chamber, and then the 2 conservators work very, very carefully. It's been humidified and are unraveling it, right? You see how it actually, once it's humidified, it's actually unfolding, right? Now, sometimes you'll unfold a couple of layers, and like I said, you put it back in the humidity chamber and you rework it. They also sometimes put methyl alcohol in the base, and that hastens the humidification process. Yep. And then once you unravel it, you put the little glass files, on. So this was a very interesting scroll, which is, it was quite, you can see it's quite big, right? A lot of these scrolls are very fragmentary. This one is pretty big. And what it actually turned out to be, there was a very wide inner scroll, which was rolled up and then folded in half. And then that was rolled inside an outer sheet of bark, which was written on, or one text, right? So the two bits of bark are different dimensions, but they have written on them one text. So here's the inner bit, and you can see the fold at the end, right? So it's this is the widest piece of Gandhari manuscript we've seen so far, and it was folded in half. Now that represents a challenge for conservation because it's very dense, right? So here you have, they've humidified it, and as they open it, they're putting little Sympathetic chips of paper, of this stuff into to try and prise it open. Yep. So here they've humidified it. They're actually unfolding it. Oh, nearly lost it. You see how wide that is? Yeah, that's really a wide piece of bark. But what's interesting is it's about this wide, but the scribe about 5 centimeters in the margin did a horizontal line and only wrote on the right hand side. So I don't know why he chose such a wide piece of bark if he was leaving a margin, unless eventually he wanted to leave marginal notes or something. I don't know, but there's no marginal notes there. Okay. And then that piece itself is unraveled. This manuscript took a week to conserve. Now, we're not just doing that. We're doing several manuscripts at the same time. And so very, very careful work. Yep. Highly skilled. Yeah. And expensive. Okay, so what you end up with, the outer bit of bark was conserved in this frame. Yep. And the inner part is this one here, right? So what is this text? Really interesting text. It's clearly a Gandharan composition, and a lot of this literature is indigenous Gandharan compositions. Some of it is, I showed you the Atthakavagga, that's clearly transmitted from another Prakrit in the Gangetic lowlands and translated to Gandhari. But a lot of this is composed in Gandhara. This is a story in which there's two Yaksha generals, you know what a Yaksha is, and one of them, they're Senapatis, and the father and son. And Ananda asks the Buddha, well, what's the future of these guys? And the Buddha tells a story whereby in the next life, the father will be another Yaksha general and the son something else. And then in another one, he'll be a king, and then so on and so on. And what's particularly interesting is at one point, the main Yaksha general, he is reborn as the Kushan king Vimataktu, right? So the lineage is Kujala Kadphises, who founds the dynasty, 1st century of the Christian era. Then Vimataktu, or he's called Vimataktuma in this story, he's then Vima Kadphises, then Kanishka, right? Really important lineage. And then eventually he becomes a Buddha in the future. So here are local Gandharan storytellers, monks, telling a story whereby the ruling king becomes, the background to a ruling king, namely he was a Yaksha general in the past, and that he will become a Buddha in the future, right? You can interpret that in different ways, but really interesting story. Okay, so I just want to show this. Okay, so what are the texts that are conserved, right? Okay, we can start now. These divisions into Shravakayana, mainstream or whatever, and Mahayana, these are very loose. They're just working categories, right? Um, Start with Pratimoksha, the Sangati Sesha rules. These are ones that have parallels in other languages. We have then Agama Sutras or verse texts, namely the Arthapada, Arthakavaga, unidentified verse plus prose sutra. A fragment this we conserved in July this year, Itivuttaka, part of the Itivuttaka, which has a Chinese translation, some Sanskrit fragments. Unidentified verse text, which describes the death of the Buddha, including some verses who are, in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, when the Buddha dies, various individuals, gods, Anuruddha, Ananda utter verses. They include some of those verses, but it doesn't appear to be a full sort of canonical version. So maybe I need to move this out of this to a local production. Abhidharma, I put that more under commentary or exegetical generally. Non-canonical texts without overtly Mahayana features. So one discusses the distribution of a monk's robes after his death, right? Another, an account for the procedure of ordaining a monk, which ends with a list of those who are not to be ordained. And this is the one which is written by the same scribe as some Vinaya texts in the Bajau collection. And then another which gives classification of an upasaka in the ordination of Rahula, the Buddha's son. Yep. So roughly Vinaya. I was hoping that on the basis of this, I could tell the Nikaya affiliation of the school that produced at least those manuscripts, not necessarily the whole collection, because we don't know what the whole collection represents. But it didn't pan out so well. It's not identical, but the Pratimoksha is closest to the Mahasangika Lokottaravada version, right? Then we have prose texts without parallel but of identifiable genre. That is, they talk about dukkha and so on in canonical language, sutra verse. Verse texts without parallel but of identifiable genre or topic. So one is a biography of the Buddha that has no parallel, and it's in a type of matra chandas, an unusual meter and perhaps an indigenous meter. Another, which is Ratchakumari, is the local Gandharan alphabet, and this verse text, the first word of each pada of a verse illustrates the four padas, illustrate the letter of the alphabet. Then you get a mention of the verse text that mentions Nagasena. It's not a Milindapanna, but it mentions him. Another which includes many elements or verses that you'll find in the Tera Gata Jataka and so on. The topic appears to describe the progressive abandonment of the fetters after hearing the teaching of the Buddha. Another one topic is anger, its negative effects, the positive effects of abandoning, and the recommendation to abandon it. Right, this is in Trishtub Anushtub. A stotra, praising the Buddha's indifference towards pain, such as a thorn piercing his foot, and spectacles such as the visit of the courtesan Ambapali, and the Lichavis. And this is in Malini meter, which is quite a poetical late meter, or it's unusual meter. Another gives an account of the Buddha and his teaching and a variety of meters and so on. We then get texts that I think can be classed as Mahayana based on the parallels, that is, such as the Pratyutpana Samadhi Sutra, 5 chapters so far, some of which are just little remnants, Suchinti Sutra, Samadhi Raja Sutra, and then texts that appear to have Mahayana orientations based on their terminology, such as Bodhisattva, Mahasattva. The topic of this one appears to be the decline of the Buddha's teaching. Another one appears to be Mahayanic character, as suggested by the phrase, what is the equivalent of Sanskrit Mahayana Gachanti, or Gachati. He goes by the great vehicle. Another lists or discusses an upasaka's practice of Buddhanusmriti and the results. Another, that one I showed you, the names of Tathagatas and the benefits of honoring them. Another one records, or as a sutra describing the future rebirth states of the two yakshas, the one I just mentioned, right? And then you get scholastic treatises. This one here, I showed you the book published by Andreas Schlosser, which is 3 Mahayana treatises in the Bajau collection. This is by the same scribe and has the slightly different topic, but it has certain words which are very rare in Buddhist literature. So clearly it's the same author, yep, and scribe. And then we get a whole bunch of unidentified things, some of which, because the fragment's very poor, others I just can't find parallels so far, all of these ones here. But this is all early days. And then we get administrative documents such as the Buddhist ledger, the monastic ledger I showed you before, or a drawing, right? Okay, now that is that's the Islamabad collection. And, you know, you can bind that with, say, the Bajau, and the other ones are part of the larger collection. You're looking at a really big collection of really diverse literature, you know, representing texts representative of what we might regard to be the early strata of Buddhist literature, Atthakavagga, Sutta Nipada, up to Mahayana texts, right? And local stories that are being produced in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Yep. Okay. So back to the Islamabad collection, which is the housing of these Gandhari manuscripts at the Islamabad Museum, and their conservation there does a couple of important things, many things, of course, from our perspective as Buddhist scholars. It's amazing, you know, witness to the wealth of Buddhist literature of ancient Gandhara, providing these all of the reasons I set out before, early witnesses of this, you know, literature, etc. But importantly, it's in contemporary period, it sets a precedent for the reversal of the common scenario whereby manuscripts such as these are taken out of the country of origin, which represents a significant loss of cultural heritage to the people of Afghanistan, Pakistan. It also will form the basis, I think, of repatriation of material that has been taken out, because now we have built a conservation space and it's a museum, and people who want this material, who know how they can look after it, and that's where it belongs, right? And it's also the basis then for actually better informing people in Pakistan about their Buddhist heritage, which, you know, you go to museums in Pakistan and you'll see a Buddhist image and it will have a little description next to it. Some of the time it's wrong, some of the time it's inadequate. Most Pakistanis would not know what a bodhisattva is. There's very little background that can inform them, but they're keen and interested. It will also form the basis for collaboration with Pakistani scholars and for training Pakistani students in order to promote the conservation of such material. Now, and also to train Pakistani scholars in these languages, right? There's currently no one in Pakistan who can do what I do or we do with this material. Be like somebody in Thailand, no one who knows Pali, right? That's what it's equivalent to. Okay, we're conserving the Islamabad collection of Gandhari manuscripts, but manuscripts are turning up all the time. The Department of Archaeology Museum is the federal authority, and anything that is seized at the borders or repatriated comes to them. So on the left, you see Bactrian manuscripts, so they must come from Afghanistan, not Pakistan, northern Afghanistan, and they're secular documents probably. They need conserving. And then the ones on the right are manuscripts that clearly come from the Gilgit region that were in the Martin Skoyen collection in Norway, a private collection, and he sort of was forced to repatriate them to Pakistan, but they're just sent and they need conserving. So that conservation space we built, and hopefully training conservators, will be a basis for Pakistan being able to look after its own Buddhist manuscript history. Similarly, in the Punjab, so a friend of mine, Mohammed Hamid, professor of archaeology at Punjab University, he's actually teaching first year Sanskrit. He trained under Monica Zinn in Germany. There's a couple of Pakistani scholars, mostly archaeologists, art historians, who trained in Germany and elsewhere. So these manuscripts started turning up on the antiquity trade, and those archaeologists recognized where they came from, went and sort of stopped that work. Basically, they're later, this is Sharada script, so 6th century Sanskrit texts, and they're mostly secular documents. But what's interesting is the Punjab, nobody thought that, birch bark manuscripts would turn up in the Punjab because it's much more moist, right? But here we have them. So they need conserving. So he could bring them up to Islamabad and they could be conserved there. As I said, there's no language skills. They do. Professor Hamid in Punjab University, Professor Muiz at Qaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad are teaching Sanskrit, but just first year at the moment. So Jason Nealis and I have been working with them to try and strengthen Sanskrit, and this will require funding, etc. But in December last year, we ran a 3-day workshop introducing students of the Qaida, this is Masters of Archaeology students, to Sanskrit and Gandhari, right? Now, you can't learn these languages in 3 days, but it's an introduction, right? That will take many years. You can't introduce capacity like you have in Thailand in Pali overnight, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think there's an interest. Okay. How are we going for time? Almost finished. I just want to quickly show you. So what we're also keen on is making this material available to wider audiences in Pakistan. So this is just a pilot. This is what's called a story map, which basically tells the background to Gandhari manuscripts in English, but we intend to have this material translated into Urdu or Pashto, right? So people can access it. Similarly, we have developed sophisticated digital resources, particularly a former student of mine, Ian McCrabb, who owns an IT consulting company. He did a doctorate with me just for fun on Gandhari reliquary inscriptions. Of course, it was a digital project. And then there's this, along with Stefan Baums in Munich and Andrew Glass, who works now at Microsoft, student of Richard Solomon. This is a program called Read, where basically you have an image and say, okay, so if I click on this, the transcription below, the word Eva appears. Now it's a bit fragmentary here. And then also a little box will pop up saying Eva, indeclinable, Sanskrit Evam, Pali Evang, thus, right? So it's giving you that information. On the basis of the intimate connection between the akshara and the transliteration, you can generate a glossary, right? So now, say, for example, I can say, well, show me all the examples of idam in this text. Yep. Or this may not work, and you can configure this differently so that we have a translation. So a translation in English. And also because Gandhari is quite difficult, the way into it for scholars like yourself or others is Sanskrit. So we normally produce a Sanskrit chaya, a translation, which you can show. And then this is a paleographic report. So I can say, show me all the examples of the letter Ka, right? So then you can start combining corpora together to do that. Similarly, Ian and I have been, and his students, his workers, I should say, in his company, have been expanding that to. So we launched a digital journal of Journal of Gandhari Buddhist Texts, which that is. Most digital journals are flat PDFs. That's a fully interactive resource, right? It's a great pedagogical resource. You can go there and you can click on a word and see the Kharoshthi script. You can learn the script and the grammar and so on. Yep. This is applying that same technology to Buddhist images. So here you have this year five Buddha triad that's on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So here you've got the various elements of the work, such as the robe, and then you can have notes, which is this scholar said this about the robe, and so on, right? And then the tree, what's the tree? This scholar said this, that scholar said this, and so on. And this is expansive. You can add and, to this. And then we work closely with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who produced that image, but they also produced this beautiful 3D image. So, okay. As art historians, for your work, you are restricted to going to a museum and seeing it behind a glass cabinet or a flat 2D image. So here you have, you can have, fantastic, right? And we've done this with reliquaries and several other things. And then also, this is which is basically an item article, which is a little bit like a encyclopedia article. It's not new research. It gives you an account of where does the object come from, who said what about it, etc. You can expand that, contract it as you like. You could publish an academic article like this. This is actually an article in the Journal of Gandhari Buddhist Texts. And then finally, so the inscription, we did this because it has an inscription and same story, right? So it gives you the grammar of it. Actually, I don't know whether this one has it. I don't think I can bring it up so easily, but because each of the segments of the artwork each of the components is segmented, we then have basically a catalog. So you can, with just the cutout bit of, say, the robe, and you could do that. And you could eventually say, give me all examples of a Buddha's Ushnisha in this corpus or whatever, right? So that's now finally, okay, so that's a digital. If you want to know more about this article, this Islamabad collection, I wrote this article. You can get all my publications from academia.edu, or if you want to know more about the Gandhari manuscripts, generally this book by Richard Solomon's fantastic, he gives a more detailed account of what I've just given in 1 hour. And also it's an anthology of English translations of these new manuscripts. So that's a very nice text. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Margala, for your fascinating talk. And I think that we have a couple of time for questions, and also discussions. If anybody have some questions regarding to the presentations or apart from, it's okay.
Shall I stop sharing or keep sharing?
ใช้กดแชร์ไว้ก่อนไหมครับ I think that keep sharing is
Okay,
okay.
fine. Mahesh, please.
Mahesh, please.
Anyway, I think I could be loud enough. Is it okay? Yeah. So my two questions. One is about this Islamabad collection, as you shown that it has lots of variety in terms of what texts we have there. So So it's a very wide range. And if you also add the Bajao collection and the other collection, which is also part of this collection, I mean, what, in your opinion, what could explain why one would put such a collection of things which are, so to say, not unrelated, but I mean, covering different area. Like we have Vinaya Sutra, we have kind of poetry, we also have some like biographies, and we can see that it's a collection which probably also ranges like many centuries of work, I mean, together. So what would explain that? And why
Yes.
should one have that kind of
I
collection?
think that this is still a work in progress, Mahesh. So, first stage is to conserve them, and we don't even yet know all of the texts. There's another 10 unconserved scrolls that we'll hopefully do in February next year. So then we'll have a better idea of the collection. But you're right, even now, you can see it's a very diverse collection. In some ways, the date of these manuscripts, so I've had quite a lot of them carbon dated, and sometimes at two different laboratories to just, verify. And, basically the collection is sort of possibly first century, but more around second century. The first century BC, more around the second century. So actually a fairly short time span. But yet, in terms of the diversity of genres, in some ways it matches more the Bamiyan manuscripts, which scan some 6-7 centuries, right? Where you've got, Vinaya, and you've got early texts, and you've got a lot of Mahayana texts and everything in between. So the trouble is we don't know where this collection came from. Really, we think it's northern Pakistan, but even then we don't know. Was it found in one monastery, or was it a collection that was put together in modernity from different sources, right? That's a problem. My feeling is there's a homogeneity to scribal hands, dates, and so on, that they probably comes from one source. So it suggests to me, and this is all very exploratory and beginning, which is, a Buddhist community in Gandhara at this period is reading everything and creating everything, right? And what's particularly interesting is this is the biggest collection of Mahayana texts in Gandhari, right? Or texts you could roughly put in that category. And, yet there's also the Atthakavagga and everything else. So these guys are reading everything. Now, the picture I sort of have in my mind is that, let's say, just for argument's sake, it's a collection that comes from one monastery and it spans a couple of centuries from that monastery. Now, those manuscripts may have been sourced elsewhere because monasteries probably lent manuscripts to each other, or, whatever, they moved between places. And that you had members of that community who tended to specialize or favor reading what we might call mainstream or Shravakana texts. But there were some authors and students who, were really taken by these ideas, the Mahayana, and now there's others in this room who are more expert at the Mahayana than I am. Is this the early phase? Is this really early? Is it a couple of centuries already since we've seen the beginning of these sorts of ideas developing, or genres? And I think, or even there's to the members of this community, there's no distinction. They're Buddhists writing about the Dharma in different ways and from different perspectives. So there's many different ways of looking at the material. So that's, I think, yeah.
There's one more thing which
Yes.
I'd like to ask you. Now, this is more about in modern times, what you see is, there's this nationalist ideas, and which often tend to reject the historical realities. Now, what is a kind of a sentiment or approach in Pakistan when you're doing this? I mean, working with this material. Scholarly approach, as well as maybe approach in the museum or an administrative level? I mean, how people look at it.
Yeah. So, if you didn't hear the question, it was what a Pakistani's attitude towards this material. There's a tendency from outsiders to think that all Muslims are iconoclasts, right? And that's not my experience at all in Pakistan. Now, I'm mostly dealing with museum curators, archaeologists, conservators, art historians, and highly educated and elite levels of Pakistan society. That's who I'm dealing with. And among that community, they're very enthusiastic about this material. They want to see it kept in the country, conserved. Most of the staff of the Department of Archaeology and Museum, as the name implies, are archaeologists, right? And their job, they do the best job possible under the restraints of limitation of resources to preserve Pakistan's heritage, Buddhist, Islamic, or whatever, right? So they are very keen on this material, and there's a lot of interest, I think, in it, and it will increase. Now, that's one level. The other level is the Pakistan government is keen on developing tourism in Pakistan, and Buddhist tourism is a real thing. When I was there in Taxila, July 24, it was like 45 degrees in the sun, but I took one of the conservators out to Taxila because I was a bit crazy. And there was a Thai group walking around the Taxila, right? More crazy. But, and I've seen other Buddhist groups and they're very keen. There was a Thai monk, I can't now remember his name, who seems to be quite well known here, who spent the Vasa in Gandhara, and he went to all these Buddhist sites and he produced this glossy book with him sitting in here, there, the other. He went to, was hosted by Professor Abdul Samad, who was trained by Harry Falk in Germany, who is now head of the archaeological division in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and was head of the museum. They donated, if you go to Peshawar Museum, which has a fantastic collection of Gandharan art, as the entrance hall is a Thai reliquary cabinet, that was donated by this monk, right? So Pakistan is keen on developing this, right, as a source of foreign revenue, etc. So as far as I see, there's interest on all levels. I don't get any hostility. But when I am in Pakistan, my job is not to promote Buddhism. My job is to preserve heritage. So that's how I present it. It's about history and heritage. Yep.
Yes, may I ask, when did the Brahmi script make first appearance in Kantara region?
Yes, when did the Brahmi script first appear in the Gandhara region? Actually, I don't think I know the answer to that in terms of inscriptions. Now, Ashokan inscriptions are in Kharosthi script. So whereas all these other inscriptions are in Brahmi. In Bamiyan, as I said, there's these Gandhari fragments in Kharosthi script, and they're about the 3rd and 4th century of the Christian era. And the earliest Brahmi script Sanskrit language is 2nd century Kushan of the Prajnaparamita, I think. And so there's an overlap. Now, I don't know I can't now remember whether there are inscriptions in Brahmi before that period. I think not, because I don't think we're getting Sanskrit and Brahmi in inscriptions anywhere in India until about the 1st, 2nd century. Yeah. But I stand corrected on that. Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Where's the speaker? Oh, they're hiding. Okay.
So I wonder, after you do the conservation, is Does the environment still affect the material? For example, light,
Yes, a light. Yep.
or anything else?
So we actually, you saw, I don't know if you noticed, but in the semi-finished conservation space, there are these two big air conditioners. So they should run 24 hours a day. Now, when I'm out of the country, I have no idea. And a problem is the cost of that, because electricity is very expensive in Pakistan. So we've been in discussion about us buying some solar panels, because the museum wants to go solar, to actually power them. So it's not a drain, because what's important is that what we're doing, although we're doing, you could say it's a great thing for the museum in Pakistan, that's at a cost to them. They've got to do that. So with the money we raised from Deity and Cancer Foundation, there is written into that $5,000 Australian dollars a year to maintain the space over time. So the ideal is that it's temperature controlled. I have to source conservation standard boxes, but also, I don't know if you noticed, but there was a cabinet there. That's where the manuscripts are kept. That's actually borrowed from the Koreans. It's not a purpose built. So I need to raise actually extra funding to have made a purpose built storage cabinet for manuscripts, not just these, but any other future ones that are coming in, right? So that would be dark, temperature controlled, humidity shouldn't go a certain level. Islamabad swings becoming very cold in the winter to very hot and humid in the summer. Yeah. So it's not like, you go to the British Library where these manuscripts are. Those manuscripts are kept in a vault in the basement, which is fireproof. If there's a fire, the oxygen's sucked out of the room and they can never burn. All the precious things of the British Library, that's what the British Library can afford, right? We can't do that, but we'll do our best. Yeah.
And another question, we saw that the birch bark is very fragile, but what about the ink? Do you find any difficulties about that?
So the ink seems to be fast. It doesn't even run with water. So the humidity. I had, as I said, some of the ink analyzed in the laboratory in Sydney University. It's a carbon-based ink, which we sort of knew. But what we don't know is I've got a chemical breakdown, but I need to work with a chemist to understand what, say, the trace elements of zinc. And what I want to know is how was the ink produced, right? And also I want to know, how did you prepare birch bark to be written on? And we had that blank pieces analyzed and couldn't find any trace elements. It might have just disappeared, or what we would assume you might either burnish it or oil it or do something. We just don't know. Yeah. So but the ink is quite stable. Yep. Please.
So we come to the conservative process.
Maybe please use the microphone. Yeah.
Regarding to the conservative process, as we have seen that the material is so fragile, so far, is there any alternative conservations? For example, like doing a CT scan and reading without unfolding, for example.
Yeah.
Is there anyone?
Yeah, so that's a topical issue, which is, some of you might know there was articles about the Herculaneum scrolls. These are Greek scrolls that were, I think they're Greek or Latin, which were burnt in when Vesuvius exploded in Naples, and they just turned to ash. They're carbonized rolls, so you can't unroll them. So now they've developed techniques to scan them, which reads the deposition of ink, and then you need iron in the ink, at different levels, and then you feed the database of aksharas into the system, and it can read them, right? But you need to interpret the data. So speaking with the conservators thought you couldn't do that because they're not iron-based inks, but I was speaking to somebody else who did one of my students who did quite a lot of research, and she thinks you can. But luckily, for the most part, we don't need that because you can see we can conserve them. Yeah. So now it's possible that there are some some of the ones that were conserved in hard plastic that can't, soft plastic and heat sealed, that can't be opened, and that they're folded, and so we can't open it. So with that, some of these technologies might be useful. Yeah, but that's expensive. So we're always looking for funding. Please.
Okay, I have four questions for my question. One question for mine and three questions for my friend who seeing this online from German. Okay, for my question, I saw the conservation for birch bark is seems interesting, but what do you think this kind of conservation is suitable for palm leaf, or
Yes.
what do you prefer?
So my interest and skills are mostly in Gandhari language, and the Gandhari manuscripts are virtually all on birch bark. So that's the medium I'm dealing with in this collection. But as you saw in Bamiyan, there are manuscripts that are both Gandhari on birch bark, Sanskrit on birch bark, Sanskrit on palm leaf. So palm leaf is a different medium, but it's similar. But they're not scrolls; they're poti format. So they're generally and I think palm leaf is more durable than birch bark. So generally, they're easier to conserve. But there are, yeah, that's I think the case. So it's a similar, very similar conservation method. You would be exposing them to moisture. Yeah.
Okay. Another other three questions from my friend. Do you expect new Gandhari manuscript discoveries in the coming years, or is the field now mostly focused on restarting known collections?
Okay, so we don't know what will turn up, but I suspect more will turn up. You know, this was you can see how many manuscripts are being preserved over this vast period of time due to the dryness of the environment, etc. And I think that they are turning up all the time. So the last ones I showed, which are from Punjab, they've only turned up in the last 5 years or something. And although they're not Gandhari, they're mostly not Buddhist. They're nonetheless manuscript heritage of the region. They're birch bark. So also, we don't know that there are private collectors around the world or in Pakistan who have some in their holdings. So there's a friend of mine in Pakistan, Imran Shaukat, who writes for the major English language. He writes opinion pieces for them. I showed him the conservation space, etc. He wrote a piece in which he was basically saying, here's this foreigner doing this amazing thing for our heritage. We should be doing something, and particularly those who might have manuscripts in their collection, in other words, they should be donated to museums. I suspect that there are manuscripts, maybe even from this bigger collection, that are in private hands somewhere. So hopefully they will turn up in the future. Yeah. So it's ongoing. And not just that, I mean, we have a lot of manuscripts, and there's only about 16 of us worldwide who are actively publishing this material, have the skills, but we're trying to train students. So, yep.
Okay. The second question, are there linguistic or stylistic features that correlate with sectarian affiliation, or is that correlation largely unrelatable with the purely philological level?
Yeah, so I would use Nikaya affiliation rather than sectarian affiliation. And of course, Nikaya affiliation doesn't necessarily exhibit itself in stylistic features of texts or language or phrasing. Now, it can. And for the most part, if you're looking at sort of agama, what you might say canonical texts, even though they're different, no two texts are the same, very rarely do they show any doctrinal differences, right? They're different, but they're not very doctrinal. There are, of course, texts like the Mahayana text, that's very different again. So it's generally, so the manuscripts in the senior collection, as I mentioned, and the British Library, when you compare, when it does have a parallel in another language, and one of those parallels is belonging to the Dharmaguptakas, so Chinese Digagama or the Vinaya translation, generally the Gandhari version from those collections will be closest to those Chinese Dharmaguptaka versions, which suggests that they are from the same textual lineage, at least, maybe even Nikaya. Yep. And that's the argument we would use.
Thank you.
Yep.
For the last question, for someone who wants to enter Gandhari manuscript studies, what should they start with in the first year? Language, script training, codicology, or a small editing project? And what are the most common beginner mistakes to avoid?
Okay. So you need to have patience and attention to detail.
Yes.
But basically, so my skills, I studied Sanskrit, Pali at university, Prakrit, and some Gandhari, just coincidentally before these manuscripts, Tibetan and a bit of Chinese. So more languages, the merrier. But at minimum, you would want Sanskrit and Pali. Yep. And if you can learn Chinese on the way, fantastic. Right. But Tibetan would be good because, as you see with some of the Mahayana texts, they have Tibetan parallels. Right? So it depends what your area is. So, language skills are fundamental, but that's fundamental to Buddhist studies. Yeah, no. So that would be the basis. Now, as you see, not everybody would have the stomach for this sort of work. That's an English expression, which is it's very particular type of work. You might be more interested in philosophy and big ideas and so on, and that's wonderful. But you can see what skills you need to deal with this material. It's a huge pleasure to be reading this material, the first to be reading it in 2000 years, to identify it, to, puzzle together the little fragments and, put it together like a jigsaw puzzle. Wow, this one fits here and whatever. And then to identify the text, to try to understand what is the status of that version, to identify, can we say it was produced by a particular community? What are the differences? There's a huge number of really interesting questions you could run with. So it would be, so to the answer to your question is it's basically language acquisition. Now, if you wanted to get into Gandhari, we hold a weekly session reading Gandhari text, but it's like hardcore, Gandhari. But Joe Marino at University of Washington holds what he calls a club junior, which is basically introducing students with the basic, Sanskrit Pali knowledge to Gandhari. So they're reading published editions of Gandhari, often using those tools we developed, right? Reading a text, so Anatta Lakkhana or whatever. So you could join that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, may I go to maybe the last questions from Ajahn Chanwik?
So thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I would like to go back to this collection. I would like to ask whether there are any particular texts or texts which have more than one copy that show like popularity of a text.
Yes. Popularity can be shown across the Buddhist world through, say, like the Shramanyapala Sutra, which was now you have versions in multiple different languages, right? So that suggests it was popular across the Buddhist world. In terms of Gandhara, we only have, I think, one text where you have two examples of it, and that's the Dhammapada. So the Khotan Dhammapada, and then there is in the British Library, there's a fragment of the Bhikshu Vagga, which was edited, published by Tim Lenz. And they're virtually the same. And again, there was always a question about the Khotan Dhammapada, what its affiliation was. And I think John Brough speculated Dhammaguptaka, and this one's the British Library suggests it. So there isn't really an overlap very much because we don't have that vast corpus, I mean, in Thailand, you can do a critical edition of a Pali text because there's multiple, usually, manuscripts of it. Yeah. Because you have all the witnesses. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mark Alonso. I think that you are inspiring us for doing such more research apart from like we may be familiar with the Thai manuscripts, and you just introduce us to knowing more that in the Buddhist world of Buddhist languages, we have more than the Pali, Sanskrit, we have the Gandhari, and we have other languages that preserve all the Buddha's vajana or the Buddha words. And I think that's the Gandhari is also a very interesting one. And I thought that I maybe conclude that if you want to learn Gandhari or something like that, you have to have a skill, right, as you said, and you have to be patient. And I think that everyone have to open-minded, and that you have to open that the Buddha words is not written only in the Pali or in Sanskrit, but there are other languages that conveys all the Buddha words. And I think that it's a very good opportunity to having you here during. So before we have today lecture, we also have like a small workshop that we have conducted in Hue Hin, and Professor Mark Allon and also Professor Skilling here, Professor Mahesh Deoka and Professor Lata Deoka, and also Professor Matthias Salvini, who are also very good leaders and readings us to know and explore more about the Buddhist languages. And thank you very much on behalf of the South Asian Languages and Department of.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Thank you, and hope that we can give have more collaborations. That I think that the difficulty is that we cannot easily access to the Gandhari text, but if we have like a more collaborations between UN and university and within other university partner network that we have Sinapakorn, Tamakai here, and also Mahidol here. So I think that we can explore more about the Gandhari and make the Gandhari to be known more in our in the international level, and especially for the Thai people as well. Thank you so much, Professor. And at last, I would like to give some present of token from the Ratchakumari Surinthorn Foundation. This is a very nice token that have the pictures of the Princess Ratchakumari Surinthorn to give for you. Right. Okay. This is T-shirt of the Princess Surinthorn. Very nice. And This is the book, but in Thai for
I'll have to learn Thai.
and also this one.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we also have we can we have a group photos, but before we have a token also give for Professor Mahesh Deoka and Professor Lata Deoka also. Yeah.
Am I leaving the meeting?
มีเสื้อของอาจารย์ปีเตอร์ให้อาจารย์ปีเตอร์